The war in Europe is no longer a localized conflict orchestrated solely by Moscow. It is a critical, subordinate phase of a grander, long-term strategy designed in Beijing. The evidence is clear. Vladimir Putin has transitioned from a defiant global rival to a junior partner, a direct subordinate in a meticulously planned two-front geopolitical gambit aimed at fundamentally breaking the post-Cold War world order. This assessment is not based on speculation. It is based on visible, material preparation. China is not merely observing the current conflict, it is actively preparing for the next one, a conflict that centers on the Taiwan Strait. The most damning proof of this preparation lies in China's frantic, massive oil stockpiling. Despite a global market that is saturated with surplus oil, a condition that should naturally drive prices down, Beijing is systematically accumulating a colossal strategic reserve, estimated at between 1.4 and 1.8 billion barrels. This behavior defies simple economic logic. China could wait and buy cheaper, but it chooses not to. It is deliberately manipulating the market to hoard fuel. The reason for this resource accumulation is singular and chilling: sanctions resilience. China is signaling its total readiness to endure a massive disruption to global supply chains in the event of an invasion of Taiwan. They are preparing for a world where Western sanctions cut off their access to critical energy imports. A reserve of this magnitude provides them with over 6 months of uninterrupted energy supply, giving them a vital time window to execute their military goals without instantly collapsing their economy. This is a level of deliberate preparation that signals a leadership fully committed to the possibility of war, and it is the foundation upon which the entire Moscow-Beijing axis is built. This material readiness directly underpins the strategic threat now facing NATO. The world's top military and intelligence leaders are increasingly concerned about a coordinated two-front attack. The strategy is simple, elegant, and catastrophic. Russia creates a massive, sustained crisis in Europe, a controlled crisis that consumes the attention, resources, and leadership of the United States. While the US is pinned down and forced to commit its naval and air assets to stabilizing the European theater, China sees its golden opportunity to move decisively on Taiwan. Putin's role in this scenario is not that of a co-conspirator. It is that of a military distraction, the man who lights the fuse in Europe to clear the stage for Beijing's ultimate strategic objective in the Pacific. This realization fundamentally reframes the nature of Russian aggression. The ongoing provocations, the drone attacks on Poland, and the repeated violations of European airspace are not signs of Moscow's strength. They are the required opening moves in a larger game designed in Beijing. Moscow's desperation to distract the West is a direct measure of China's own timeline for its aggression. The architect of this chaos is not Moscow, it is Beijing. And the Western world must now recognize that it is not fighting two separate conflicts. It is facing a single, coordinated, existential threat that is actively moving toward its decisive phase. The global economic and security systems are now under assault, and the only way to counter this is to recognize the grand strategy and refuse to play the role assigned by the architect of two fronts. We've established the terrifying scale of China's global ambition and its meticulous preparation for a two-front war. Now, we must analyze the single most critical tactical vulnerability facing NATO. China holds the red button over all modern European warfare. This is not a metaphor. The entire conflict in Ukraine, the first true drone war, is wholly dependent on the China factory for its existence, and Beijing's ability to flip an export switch could instantly cripple NATO's ability to fight. To understand the severity of this threat, you must understand the anatomy of a modern FPV drone. This isn't just a toy, it's a sophisticated, flying computer that requires a complex array of components: the flight controller boards, the GPS modules, the video transmitters, the powerful electric motors, the batteries, the specialized FPV goggles and antennas. Almost every single one of these items, from the smallest integrated circuit to the carbon fiber frame, is manufactured in China. This is a fact that has been a profound blind spot for NATO for years. The West focused on expensive, multi-billion-dollar fighter jets and missile defense systems, creating a devastating dependency on a low-cost, high-volume technology controlled entirely by its main geopolitical rival. This technical dependency gives Beijing catastrophic leverage. If a conflict were to erupt between Russia and NATO, China would not need to dispatch a single submarine or fire a single missile at a European target. Its action would be far simpler, far more surgical, and instantly decisive. An export ban on FPV components to all NATO nations, while simultaneously ensuring the flow of supply to Russia. The consequences would be instantaneous and catastrophic. European armies, which rely on FPV drones for 80% of their forward reconnaissance, targeting, and battlefield awareness, would suddenly be blind. The supply of essential components would dry up in a matter of weeks, and the ability to replace losses or manufacture new drones would vanish. The current situation with Ukraine perfectly illustrates this dilemma. China is allowing the components to flow to Ukraine because it keeps the conflict grinding, consuming Russian resources. But its ultimate loyalty lies with its strategic goals. In a direct conflict with NATO, China's priority would shift to ensuring a Russian victory to achieve its goal of breaking the Western alliance. Cutting the drone supply would instantly grant Russia drone supremacy by default, turning a potential stalemate into a one-sided conflict. Imagine Poland, with its hundreds of modern tanks and jets, suddenly fighting a sophisticated Russian military that has total eyes-in-the-sky dominance, while Polish soldiers have no drones for spotting, targeting, or self-defense. Their sophisticated Western hardware would be vulnerable and blind. The expertise and manufacturing agility for these components do not exist at scale in the West. It took decades and billions of dollars to build the Chinese manufacturing ecosystem. Europe and the US cannot suddenly conjure up the required capacity for flight controllers and microchips needed for a full-scale drone war. This profound structural vulnerability is the cornerstone of Beijing's grand strategy. It allows them to threaten the entire European theater without direct engagement. The drone supremacy trap is the ultimate leverage point, proving that the technical reality of the battlefield has now been weaponized by geopolitics.
We've established that China holds the ultimate tactical leverage through its control of the drone supply chain. Now we confront the terrifying strategic scenario that defines the Moscow-Beijing axis, a coordinated, simultaneous attack on two continents. This is not a matter of two separate regional conflicts. It is a meticulously planned two-front strategy designed to break the fundamental structure of Western power and expose the absolute limits of the United States military. The core objective of this double attack is simple: resource commitment and strategic pin-down. Russia's role is to create a European crisis just large enough to force the United States to commit irreplaceable, high-value military assets, aircraft carriers, specialized reconnaissance planes, and rapid deployment forces. This diversion must be sustained, consuming US leadership attention, political will, and logistic resources. The attack would manifest not as a total all-out war, which risks nuclear escalation, but as a series of managed crises of medium intensity. Imagine the scenario. Russian MiG-31s brazenly violate the airspace of the Baltic nations, while drone swarms delivered by Russia's shadow fleet of vessels in the North Sea fly over Denmark, Sweden, and Poland, paralyzing civilian airports and forcing NATO to expend its most expensive air defense missiles. Simultaneously, ground skirmishes erupt on NATO's eastern border, creating a crisis that demands the urgent deployment of the US Army's rotational brigades. The resulting chaos and the mandatory response protocols of NATO would compel Washington to commit significant resources to the European theater, exactly what Beijing needs. The direct consequence of this coordinated diversion is the opening of the window of opportunity for China. With the United States military focus fractured and its resources committed to Europe, China then executes its ultimate strategic move on Taiwan. The strategic calculus is perfect. The US can handle one major conflict, but two, started concurrently thousands of miles apart, creates an impossible operational strain. The Moscow-Beijing axis understands that this is the only way to challenge US global supremacy, by forcing a resource split so severe that the US must choose which ally to save, a decision that would either break the NATO alliance or lead to a guaranteed defeat in the Pacific. This strategic coordination is already visible in the integrated use of military and economic leverage. We saw this in the subtle game played during the recent Russia-Belarus exercises. When the drills led to a temporary closure of the Polish border, rail traffic, a vital conduit for Chinese goods to the EU market, was blocked. China then used diplomatic pressure, backed by the implicit threat of continued Russian military provocation, to get the border reopened. This demonstrates a seamless integration of strategy. Russia's military moves are not just for show, they are tools of economic and geopolitical coercion that Beijing uses against the European Union, which is both a strategic rival and a massive consumer market. The expert consensus among NATO leadership now acknowledges this threat openly. The possibility of a simultaneous attack is real, and the West must prepare for a coordinated, integrated challenge to its dominance. The era of seeing Russia and China as two separate problems is over. They are an axis, and their strategy is built on exploiting the fundamental vulnerability of Western logistics and decision-making by forcing a crisis on two fronts. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It is the strategic foundation of the world we are now entering.
We've dissected the military maneuvers and the grand strategy of a two-front war, but the full picture of the Moscow-Beijing axis is not complete without analyzing the insidious, non-military flank of their attack, the campaign of political subversion. This is the Trojan Horse strategy, the coordinated effort to fracture NATO and the European Union from the inside out by funding, supporting, and installing pro-Beijing Eurosceptic regimes across the continent. This is a deep game of political corruption designed to work in perfect synchronization with Russia's military provocations. The ultimate goal is not to win the war with tanks, but to win the peace with economic dependency. The Kremlin initiates the crisis, the drone overflights, the airspace violations, the border closures. This is designed to terrify the European electorate and expose the perceived weakness of NATO and the US. Then, Beijing steps into the political vacuum. The resulting fear and anxiety drives voters toward the nationalist, Eurosceptic, and anti-globalist political parties that promise to make peace with Russia and prioritize national security over international cooperation. These parties are the political product that Beijing and Moscow are actively cultivating. The evidence for this political corruption is now undeniable. We are not just talking about influence, we are talking about direct financial engagement designed to erode European unity. Hungary's embrace. Viktor Orban serves as the prime example of the political payoff. He is openly a pro-China and Eurosceptic leader who has welcomed massive Chinese investment. China is building automotive plants, investing heavily in the battery and green energy sectors, and establishing deep economic dependencies that make Hungary a crucial staging ground for Beijing's expansion into the heart of Europe. This influence is built on massive financial dependency, not shared ideology. Germany's exposure. This insidious influence extends even to the economic heart of Europe. Reports indicate that parties like Alternative for Germany, AfD, have received funding or political support from Beijing-linked sources. The goal is simple: sow domestic political chaos, undermine support for the European project, and install a governing body that is less likely to support robust anti-China or anti-Russia foreign policies. These parties are the political product that Beijing and Moscow are actively cultivating. The evidence for this political corruption is now undeniable. We are not just talking about influence, we are talking about direct financial engagement designed to erode European unity. Hungary's embrace. Viktor Orban serves as the prime example of the political payoff. He is openly a pro-China and Eurosceptic leader who has welcomed massive Chinese investment. China is building automotive plants, investing heavily in the battery and green energy sectors, and establishing deep economic dependencies that make Hungary a crucial staging ground for Beijing's expansion into the heart of Europe. This influence is built on massive financial dependency, not shared ideology. Germany's exposure. This insidious influence extends even to the economic heart of Europe. Reports indicate that parties like Alternative for Germany, AfD, have received funding or political support from Beijing-linked sources. The goal is simple: sow domestic political chaos,
undermine support for the European project, and install a governing body that is less likely to support robust anti-China or anti-Russia foreign policies. The Babiš factor. Leaders like Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic, who actively promoted Chinese interests and are deeply Eurosceptic, demonstrate how these political actors become the perfect Trojan horses. They are the political face of an attack that seeks to paralyze the EU's ability to act decisively against aggression. The terrifying brilliance of this strategy is how the military threat and the political subversion feed one another. Russia's military provocations, the Zapad 2025 drills, the border closures, the airspace violations, provide the necessary shockwaves. They create the political instability and anxiety that fuels the rise of these Eurosceptic pro-China regimes. The ultimate prize for China is not just political dominance. It is to turn the European Union from a powerful political rival and a key US ally into a massive, fragmented, and dependent market sphere under Beijing's economic control. They seek to destroy the EU's cohesion, eliminate its political voice on the world stage, and guarantee that its vast wealth is spent on internal conflicts and Chinese manufactured goods, not on supporting US global interests. This is a comprehensive political warfare strategy that complements the military two-front attack. It proves that the Moscow-Beijing axis is not relying solely on kinetic force. They are actively working to achieve geopolitical goals by corrupting and exploiting the democratic process in the West. This political fracturing of Europe is absolutely essential for the success of their military plan, as a fractured NATO is a paralyzed NATO. The West must recognize that it is not just fighting a war on the plains of Ukraine. It is fighting a war for the heart and soul of its political system. This is the single most important and overlooked front in the entire conflict.
We have meticulously analyzed the strategy of the Moscow-Beijing axis, the two-front gambit, the drone supremacy trap, and the political subversion campaign. Now, we arrive at the final, unavoidable conclusion, a harsh verdict, not just on the aggressors, but on the defense they seek to destroy. The current crisis is not a random event. It is the direct, tragic consequence of the West's strategic hesitation, a pattern of inaction that has been interpreted by our adversaries as nothing less than an invitation to execution. The fundamental flaw in Western policy was a failure of the will to act decisively against aggression. For years, the prevailing doctrine was a hope that by limiting the conflict and avoiding direct confrontation, the conflict would remain contained. This was a direct betrayal of the spirit of containment, the very doctrine that George Kennan championed to defeat the Soviet Union. Kennan's strategy was based on firmness and resolve, ensuring that Soviet expansion was met with an unyielding front. The West failed to do this. Every delayed weapon shipment to Ukraine, every refusal to sanction critical Russian assets, and every public debate over political will was read by Moscow and Beijing as a signal. The West is weak, divided, and unwilling to fight for its own principles. This hesitation was the single most crucial factor in cementing the Axis's plan. They were not waiting for the perfect military moment. They were waiting for the perfect political signal of paralysis. And when they saw the West's reluctance to act decisively, they gained the confidence to proceed with the ultimate geopolitical gamble, the guaranteed two-front attack. They are now moving forward, certain in the belief that the United States cannot and will not fight both them and China simultaneously without collapsing its alliance structure and its own logistics. The West's failure to solve the problem of a limited war in Ukraine has allowed that problem to metastasize into a crisis that threatens the entire global order. This is the ultimate confrontation with the consequences of inaction. The Axis is counting on the fragmentation of NATO, a certainty built upon the political subversion we've seen in nations like Hungary and the Czech Republic. They believe that when the missiles fly over a NATO capital, the political chaos created by their local allies will prevent a unified, overwhelming response. They are betting that fear and self-interest will triumph over collective defense, forcing every European nation to turn inward, hoarding its resources for self-defense rather than committing them to the defense of the alliance.
The time for debate, diplomatic appeals, and incremental sanctions is over. The West is now facing a war it chose not to prevent, a conflict that it must now win at a far higher cost. The only way to counter this integrated, coordinated threat is through a unified, immediate, and overwhelming show of force. This means a full industrial mobilization, an immediate acceleration of military production, and an unambiguous declaration to Moscow and Beijing that the cost of aggression is now insurmountable. The West must recognize that its choice was not between war and peace. It was, as the great thinkers of the past understood, between shame and war. By delaying the decisive action, the West chose both. And it is now incumbent upon us to mobilize with the urgency required to win the war we failed to avoid.
The final verdict, an urgent call for mobilization. The Zapad 2025 exercises and the aggressive posture of the Moscow-Beijing axis are the direct result of a fundamental failure of Western strategic will. We have run out of time for debate. The enemy is moving forward, and the consequences of inaction are no longer theoretical. The only path to deterring this guaranteed two-front conflict is through an industrial and military response that leaves absolutely no room for miscalculation in Moscow or Beijing. The West must prove, finally, that its will to survive is stronger than the Axis's will to destroy.